Some of us dream of reaching it big and becoming famous. The lavish lifestyles and fame and riches. However, one thing we don't think about when we dream of becoming famous is the terrifying prospect of deranged, obsessed fans. And that's exactly what the story of Misery explores. Released as a book by Stephen King in 1987 and then adapted into a movie in 1990, directed by Rob Reiner and starring Kathy Bates in a terrifying role and James Caan as a helpless hostage. It tells the story of acclaimed author Paul Sheldon, whom is famous for writing a series of novels called Misery. And while on his way to deliver his final book in the series, he is involved in a serious car crash during a snowstorm, where he is rescued by local Annie Wilkes, where he wakes up in her home to find that she has been tending to his injuries. Annie claims to be his #1 fan and is a true fanatic of his books, and seems genuinely kind and caring. But it doesn't take too long for her erratic and volatile behaviour to become more and more frequent, to the point where she even becomes violent and tortures Paul by some of the most brutal tactics known.
You murdered my Misery!
Annie!
Where she threatens him to write a new book, the way she wants it to be. Paul quickly realises that he is helpless and trapped, and at the mercy of someone truly psychotic, and must escape immediately.
Annie, whatever you're thinking about doing, please don't do it.
So today we are going to explore the dark side of having a fandom, as we look into the Stephen King and Rob Reiner masterpiece, Misery. By looking into 10 things that you may not know about this story and movie. The movie that proved to the world that Kathy Bates is one terrifying lady. So, let's get on with this cock-a-dokie countdown. Number 10. Stephen King only wanted a movie if Rob Reiner directed it. Rob Reiner's movie company Castle Rock had purchased the right to turn King's novel into a movie adaptation, but King was adamant that the movie could only be made of his work if Reiner was at the helm. This is because a few years earlier, Reiner had directed Stand By Me, which was based on Stephen King's story The Body, which was something of a departure from King's adaptations usually being based on King's more horrific stories. King was so pleased with Reiner's work on Stand By Me that he insisted Reiner was the only director talented enough to take on the heavy material of Misery. Number 9. Reiner used Hitchcock as an influence for making the film. By 1990, Rob Reiner had an impressive career of movie directing, having been responsible for many classic hits, such as Stand By Me, as mentioned before, along with This Is Spinal Tap, The Princess Bride, and The Sure Thing. But he hadn't yet directed a dark psychological thriller, which tapped into the dark themes of torture and obsession. Heck! Just 1 year earlier, Reiner had directed the romantic comedy When Harry Met Sally, which couldn't be further away from the dark, grisly material of Misery. So in order to get himself in the mindset for directing Misery, Reiner turned himself to the master of suspense himself, Alfred Hitchcock, as a sort of inspiration for making the movie. Which I guess makes sense, because had Hitchcock been around in 1990, it's the kind of film I could totally see him directing. Number 8. Barry Sonnenfield was the movie's cinematographer. Yep, all the way back in 1990, the movie Misery had a young cinematographer working on it, whom was none other than Barry Sonnenfield. And for those who don't know whom Sonnenfield is, well, he would go on to be quite the filmmaker himself, directing movies such as The Addams Family and Get Shorty. But he is probably most remembered for directing all 3 of the Men in Black movies. Sonnenfield also directed the 1999 movie Wild Wild West. But hey, never mind, nobody's perfect. Number 7. Annie is a metaphor for drugs. The character of Annie, who takes the injured Paul into her home and nurses him back to health, only to turn into his captor and torturer, is one truly messed up and unpredictable character. King insists that the character of Annie is indeed a metaphor for drug addiction, as King explains that Annie represented his own personal drug issues, as he explains that the drugs were his #1 fan, and that they never wanted him to leave. If anyone is familiar with King's younger years, they would know that there were issues with drug addictions. But you know what? It actually does kind of make sense that Annie is a representation of addiction. In that at first she seems loving and kind and like she wants to save you and make you feel better, and then swiftly goes all evil and toxic and is out to destroy you and render you helpless. Number 6. James Caan was in bed for 15 weeks. The role of Paul Sheldon was something of a departure for actor James Caan. He was usually known for tough guy roles and very physical demanding roles, having starred in movies such as The Godfather and Rollerball. So it was interesting seeing Caan go from a tough, no-nonsense hard guy to being a helpless damsel in distress, so to speak. And, for that matter, to be completely immobilized. Most of the movie focused on the Paul character laying in the bed of Annie's spare room. So because of this, Caan spent 15 weeks straight just lying in a bed for the movie's shoot. Yep, all his working day literally involved just him laying down. This probably caused frustration in the actor though, and led to an infamous incident where Caan showed up to work one day with an epic hangover, and thus no scenes could be shot. He did, however, offer to compensate the money lost that day for the lack of filming. Well, at least he wasn't being a dick about it, I guess. Number 5. There is a Misery stage play. As hard as it is to believe, but in 2015, Misery did in fact hit Broadway with a stage play, with none other than Bruce Willis himself in the role of Paul Sheldon. What? Bruce Willis in the role of Paul Sheldon? Wait, that's really weird. So yeah, just when you think you've seen it all, along comes the Misery stage play starring Bruce Willis to completely throw things off balance and leave you struggling to stay afloat in the depths of WTF. And in case you're wondering, the role of Annie Wilkes was played by Laurie Metcalf, who some of you horror fanatics will remember as being the main killer in Scream 2. Number 4. Reiner and Bates gave the character Annie more of a backstory. So Kathy Bates could relate to the character Annie more, her and Rob Reiner came up with a backstory to try and explain why exactly she is the way she is. After all, in the book, the only backstory we really have of Annie is that she has killed infants and elderly citizens in nursing homes. So in order to get a grasp of this complicated character, so Bates could understand her evil and cruel doings, Bates and Reiner came up to the conclusion that Annie had been abused by her father when she was little. Which, although is pretty grim subject matter, I still wish they actually put in the film, as it would have put more of a method behind the madness of Annie Wilkes. But then again, maybe we're not meant to know too much about Annie. Maybe not knowing why this lady is the way that she is part of the horror. Number 3. Bette Midler was nearly Annie. Yeah, believe it or not, but Bette Midler, that really smiley singer / actress with the massive ginger hair, who starred in that movie Beaches. Yeah, remember Beaches, that movie your mum used to watch all the damn time back in the day? Yeah, anyway, she was offered the role of Annie in the movie adaptation of Misery. Midler turned down the role because she thought it was too violent for her taste, a decision she actually ended up regretting. And thus, Kathy Bates stepped in and terrified us all. giving a truly legendary performance.
God, I love you.
I just don't know if I would have brought Bette Midler as Annie. She just doesn't seem evil enough, and is just, way too damn smiley. So if the role of Annie nearly went to someone else, then who nearly ended up in the role of Paul? Well, that leads me to my next point. Number 2, the many, and I mean many, considerations to play Paul. As mentioned before, cinematic tough guy James Caan took on the role of helpless Paul, and did so with gusto. And you really believe him when you watch him. You genuinely feel nervous for this guy and want him to somehow escape the evil clutches of Annie. However, Caan wasn't the original choice for Paul. In fact, there is an insanely long list of actors that the studio considered for the helpless character, including Warren Beatty, whom actually wanted to star in the film, but dropped out due to working on Dick Tracy, along with William Hurt, whom the studio really wanted and asked twice, and other potential actors who were asked to star in the role include Robert Redford, Harrison Ford, Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, Gene Hackman, Michael Douglas, Dustin Hoffman, Kevin Kline, and Richard Dreyfuss, all of whom turned down the role. I guess they didn't want to be lying down in bed for most of the movie getting beaten up by Kathy Bates. But thankfully Caan took on the role, and in my opinion did a great job, and was likeable, and yet you could empathise with him. You can often feel his frustration along with his sheer panic, which to me is important, because the strength of the movie depends on if we, the audience, can relate to the Paul character's sheer desperation and urgency for getting out of this very dangerous situation. Number 1. The foot axing scene was nearly in the movie. In the movie version of Misery, there is the famous scene where the Annie character breaks Paul's feet with a sledgehammer.
God's sake.
It's for the best.
Annie, please!
It is without a doubt the most terrifying moment in the film, and is so brutal, it's cringy, and definitely unleashes the true evil capabilities of Annie. However, those whom have read the book would know that originally in the novel, Annie chops one of Paul's feet off with an axe. It would seem a given, particularly for 1990, that the axe scene would not feature in the movie. However, there was actually a debate among the film crew as to whether or not they should just go balls out and use the infamous axe foot chopping scene. Which, although would have been a brave move, would also have been a fairly controversial one, so they opted to play it safe and change it to a sledgehammer instead, which apparently really bugged Bates, as she was more in favour of chopping the character's foot off with an axe. We can only assume that at that time Bates had gotten into her role a little bit too creepily well. Anyway guys, that was my look into Misery, yet another Stephen King masterpiece. After all, King is the Dark Lord of horror fiction. Anyway, I'm Minty, and if you ever have dreams and aspirations of one day being famous, just remember, if you ever have someone claiming to be your #1 fan, just get out of there. Just run away as quickly as you possibly can. See ya.